Hello, welcome to Upskilling Your Team in DDD. Thank you so much for coming out to hear what I have to say. Whether this is directly relevant for you or not, I genuinely hope that everyone is able to take away at least something from the next 25 minutes that's relevant for whatever you do, whether that's directly or indirectly, or even just some food for thought. A little bit about me. My name is Craig McCallum. I live in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'm a senior software engineer at PensionBee, a London-based fintech that operates in the pension transfer, consolidation, and management domain. There's a couple of reasons why I wanted to be here today. The first is that I wanted to share my experience building and running an in-house DDD training program. The second one is that I wanted to share those training resources with the community in the hope that that can benefit at least some of you in some way. In terms of agenda, pretty straightforward. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the DDD workshop, which is the name of our training program. That will lead into a kind of feedback and evaluation section, and then we'll close up with some key takeaways. Let's get to it. So what actually is it? So from a high-level perspective, it's basically just a hands-on introduction to DDD, and specifically it's built around this idea that design-level event storming is an incredible tool for designing software systems in a way that provide a blueprint for the code that you write. It's not a 100% kind of one-to-one match, but it does give you a really good starting point. And it's really good for forming this connection between strategic and tactical DDD for people who are interested in learning it. From a tactical perspective, we borrow heavily from an article called Functional Domain-Driven Design Simplified. Regardless of your background, coding style, language preferences, I highly recommend you check it out. It's an amazing article, definitely eye-opening for me. But why did we actually go and build something ourselves? So we build a lot of our back-end functionality in the JavaScript ecosystem on Node.js. By that, I'm also including TypeScript. And we don't really fit into object-oriented programming, but neither do we really fit into functional programming. We kind of sit somewhere in between, maybe around data-oriented programming. It's probably the closest match. But when you put those things together and then try and find something that's relevant for training your team, there's really not that much out there. Maybe some of you can come and find me and disagree and tell me about your amazing training programs. But essentially, we found this gap that we felt we needed to fill, and we decided to fill it internally, partly for budgeting reasons. When we actually came to design the program itself, we did have some kind of high-level guiding principles in mind. So the first one is that we wanted it to be accessible to everyone, whether you're a senior engineer or whether you're an apprentice or a junior engineer. We wanted that not to really make too much of a difference. There are limitations there, but with a little bit of help, everyone should be able to follow along and kind of get through this training program. We also wanted to prioritize practical elements over kind of theoretical elements. Hopefully, that's a no-brainer for everyone. Encourage and kind of facilitate exploration. So we wanted to provide a clear path that people could walk down, but give them the ability to kind of veer off this path and explore tangents and things that they personally found interesting. That was mostly for engagement purposes. We also wanted to form this kind of two-way bond between strategic and tactical DDD, which is where the event storming to code thing comes into play. And then the final one is focus on the important things. There's a reason that DDD Europe is a 3-day conference that has been going on for many years. It is a huge topic, so much to it, but if you're just getting started out, you need to figure out what is it that is going to get me somewhere in the next 6 to 12 months, what is going to have an immediate impact. Dump everything else and then focus on those core elements. So from a logistical perspective, we kind of settled on 90-minute sessions, the first 15 minutes or so kind of just covering high-level concepts. And then the remaining 75 minutes or so was working through practical exercises as a group. Group sizes were about 6 developers, and each of those groups had one DDD champion, which they were basically responsible for guiding their teams through these practical exercises making sure they had everything they needed, encouraging and facilitating this exploration, and just making sure that it ran smoothly. Let's do a bit of a deep dive and actually have a look at what's inside. So part one is just TypeScript foundations. We built it in TypeScript, but some people in our team had never written code in TypeScript before, and some people were relatively new to programming just generally. So we wanted to give people at least enough of a foundation so that they could actually work through this program with the rest of the team without getting lost. For this, we designed kind of 6 relatively simple, manageable exercises that just focused the scope of what they had to learn in the TypeScript world so that they could make it through. Part 2, we went into kind of this collaborative discovery of the domain, specifically a bit more in the kind of design level event storming rather than like big picture. Just getting people used to those elements. And for our domain, we chose a social media domain. 2 reasons for that. One is that pretty much everyone these days is a social media domain expert. And the second one is that if you scope it right, you can make it really simple. Like you can just focus on some of the key elements of social media, but you also have some flexibility there to start kicking down some doors and exploring kind of more gnarly things, kind of ad hoc, when people kind of find the need to go down those paths. We did this all online, so we're a fully remote team, which is somewhat limiting from an event storming perspective, but we did the best we could. We started with kind of these golden path events. What are the important things in a domain that represent change? So we've got things like an account being registered and a post being published and a comment being added to a post and account being followed. We then went back through that and added corresponding commands that would result in those events. We then added actors into the system because it's always useful to have your kind of end user in mind when you're doing anything in software. Step 4 was adding in the entities, and this is a whole topic on its own, so I'm not really going to go too deep into it, but essentially we focused on the important core concepts in the domain that was directly impacted by these events. One of the teams decided that the follow account event belonged with the account entity. But then through a little bit of like exploration and discussion, they kind of landed on this alternative solution, which was, oh, well, maybe we can model this as a separate follower entity related to the account, but conceptually different. And those kind of discussions are really great to have. They help you find a much better domain model over time. We went back through and started adding fail events, so identifying the ways that each command can fail for any kind of business logic-related reason. And we treated those as first-class citizens in our system, so we capture those explicitly as events. And then finally, bounded contexts. Again, a whole topic in its own, but we were basically looking at how do we break down a bigger domain into smaller, more manageable chunks. So here we have something like we've got a post and a post comment entity, and the functionality associated with that live in one domain, and our accounts and account following and blocking lives in a separate domain. And then you end up with something that looks a bit like this. And I'm definitely not going to advocate for this being an amazing representation of the domain, but it's good enough for the purposes of learning about the elements and then learning how those can be translated into code. Part 3, we start to get into entities and, okay, let's take these entities that we've identified and start representing them in the code. And that kind of forces you to start thinking, well, what actually is an entity? What uniquely defines it independently of the other entities? And one of the ways that's quite useful for doing that is just, if you just take your entity and cluster it with the events that are associated with it, then those events start to kind of reveal the attributes or the values that are an important part of that entity. So here we have an account being registered, and then that kind of maps into these attributes where we've got an email and a username and a password. And sometimes this is really clear, and again, in this example, it's very simplistic and contrived. But when you're in more complex domains and you have a lot of events and your entities are going through maybe several different states, it can be useful to look at it from this perspective and start figuring out how that actually maps into something in your software. In part 4, we start looking at how do we load and save entities but keep a domain independent of the underlying persistence layer. And for that, we introduce repositories, nothing new here, but we push the focus into, okay, how can we design interfaces for our repositories that are centered around the domain and the needs of the domain. So here we have this account registered use case again, and we have a fail event associated with that. We've got an account not being registered because an account already exists. Well, how do we know an account already exists? When we talk that through a little bit, we realize, well, if there's an account in a system that has the same username or email that someone's trying to register with, then that's an existing account. So all of a sudden we have this requirement of, well, a system has to be able to pull account entities out by their email and their username. And because we've kind of designed these repositories very explicitly coupled to our entities, we've got this connection again back to our EventStorming diagram a little bit. We've got this stuff feeding into the code that we're actually writing. In part 5, we start looking at change. At the moment, the system doesn't do anything. We've just got some entities kicking about, some validation schemas, and some repositories that let us load them and save them. But we can't actually do anything with that yet. So we introduced this concept of command handlers. And this comes back to this functional domain-driven design simplified article, where we introduced this 4-step process of, let's break it down so that we can process every command in roughly the same way. And probably this slide's a bit better for it. We can have a look on this side. We've got command data coming in, and that's associated with the blue command on our EventStorming diagram. We've got fetching state as the second step of that, and that's pulling things out of a repository. So that's state, in this case, is just a partial view of your system, all of the entities that are required in order to process this change. Those two things then get fed into this derive event block, and that performs all of our kind of business logic evaluation and checks all of our business rules. And depending on whether they pass or fail, we get an event out the other side. And that event can then be used in step 4, which is if it's a success event, there's probably some change associated with that event, and we can go in, update our entities, and we do that again back through our repositories. And as you can see from this process generally, it matches very well with the kind of elements that we've already identified on our EventStorm. So it's not one-to-one. You might need some additional entities that we haven't captured there. Maybe that's also worth capturing on your EventStorming diagram. It's really up to you. It's quite flexible. I'd love to go into the code for this, but I would probably be here for about 50 minutes. Part 6, we introduce policies. And the goal here is to start building out event-driven systems, dealing with if this, then that style business logic. And for that, we're basically just exploiting the fact that EventStorming is so event-centric in the first place and so easy to prototype with that we can kind of go back there, design a system, and then convert that into code from there. Fortunately, we have a great use case because we have a bug. Some accounts or some users are still able to see content from accounts that have blocked them. Not ideal, not what we want. So we take a step back, we go back into our EventStorming diagram, we start thinking about, well, why is this happening? How is this bug appearing in a system? We thought we'd captured this with blocking an account. And you realize that, well, you haven't captured the situation of if someone has already followed someone and then they get blocked, we still have that connection as a follower. And there's multiple ways that you can get around that, but you might come up with something that looks a little bit like this. And here we've added an additional use case, an additional process, and we're basically just connecting them event to commands. So when an account is blocked, we want to remove that follower. That could also be when an account is blocked, we want to automatically unfollow an account. So that's one way that we can do that. But now we've got a way of kind of like exploring this really cheaply without having to get our hands dirty in the code. It's really explicit. I mean, this is almost kindergarten stuff. You can show this to pretty much anyone and talk them through the process, and they will probably understand. And then at that point, it's just, well, let's turn it into code. We've already got a mechanism for building out these command handlers and generating events. Let's just provide some kind of simple utilities, abstract away all of the publish and subscribe complexity behind the scenes, and we have something that is very clear in the code itself. We've got a configure event, a configure policy utility here, which specifies the event that it cares about, and then just defines the action that it wants to take, and then under the hood, we're triggering that command to remove a follower. So after we'd kind of gone through this workshop, we sent out a survey and managed to get about 60% responses. And overall, in terms of concept and structure, people felt that it was generally quite good. They felt that the domain was reasonable for kind of exploring domain-driven design. They felt that the sessions built upon each other quite well, that the balance between theory and practice was well done. They felt comfortable asking questions, which was really important for me personally. I think that's one of the best ways of learning, is if you feel comfortable asking questions. Where it started to fall down a little bit is in terms of individual learning style. Some people felt 90 minutes was just too long. Some of them felt it was too short. Other people just want to read a book and learn 100% through text. And that is completely fine. I suppose the takeaway there is that the one-size-all aspect of training programs isn't going to be right for everyone, and you're going to have to factor that in to a kind of wider DDD adoption strategy. In terms of the oops, sorry about that. In terms of the actual content and the delivery itself, people felt that there was good kind of discussions going on, and there was room for exploration. And I think a big part of that was to do with having the DDD champions in the team. People were generally really good at following along with the theoretical concepts, but as soon as it came to actually getting into the nitty-gritty of writing code, they started to feel a little bit less comfortable and out of their depth, and I think there'd probably be a correlation between kind of seniority and how comfortable they felt. I don't have any data to back that up, but again, I suppose it's just you're probably going to have to spend more time with more junior developers to kind of get them up to speed. And here, pretty much everyone agreed that having a DDD champion in the team was just an essential thing. I think this could have been even better if we'd had even smaller teams and more people that were capable of facilitating that, but we were constrained by having about 4 people that could actually facilitate these sessions. In terms of overall impact, people felt that it helped them see the value of DDD going through this process. That in itself, for me, is a big win. I wanted to make people feel engaged with the concept generally. It also helped them understand the various different concepts. So EventStorming, how EventStorming can be used to then filter into the code and help you write DDD-centric code. Entities, repositories, these things they started feeling much more comfortable with. Command handlers, a little bit less so, but I can understand that since it's definitely by far the most complex part of the training program. And overall, final one here is that the workshop, the training, helped give people confidence to actually go and start exploring this stuff in production, which I think is probably the most important outcome here. In terms of post-training support, we asked them what they felt was important to them. And at the top, unsurprisingly, is I want to pair with people who have DDD experience. And with that, I think that's probably in relation to actual real-world projects that they're working on, probably not on these toy problems. And I think that probably aligns with most people's expectation that is the best way of learning. Pairing is an amazing way of learning, so the more of that you can facilitate, I think the happier people are going to be. The surprising one there was that people didn't feel the need for external training. Maybe that's because they've not had any experience of that, but there you go. They also had a bit of like free-form critical feedback, which was really useful to have. None of it was surprising. The top 4 there are essentially, here are some of the failure modes that can occur when you're training people. Things like the one here that says, I missed a session, it was hard to follow along with the rest of the sessions, and I totally get that. We never even factored that into the training that we did. We probably should have run follow-up sessions and made sure that everyone had access to all of the sessions before we moved on, or at least find a way to kind of run these things in parallel streams. The one at the bottom, also super important, but a very different kind of line of thought, in that they felt it was essential that as you're learning this stuff, you need to have something in the real world to start applying it to. Otherwise, your retention of these concepts just kind of falls out of your head. And I've definitely seen that quite a lot in the weeks and months post-workshop, where people forgot a lot of this stuff and they couldn't remember the details. They were kind of aware of the concepts and how they all fit together, but the details were just completely gone, and then it took a bit more pairing with those people to then bring them back up to speed. So, with that, we come to some final takeaways. One, this is probably the most important one. Creating and running a DDD training program is hard. If you've ever been to any training and said, this is a really good training session, that person has probably worked really hard to put that together. So definitely kudos to those people. I think ours was probably average. If possible, I think if you have the budget, I would probably lean on the expertise of people not in your company to do that. I think it's totally fine if you want to run your own training program. If, like us, you had a genuine motivation for doing that, because you can't just get something off the shelf. If you're in Java land, you're winning because there's probably tons of resources out there. But I think you should be committed to it, and I think those additional external resources and expertise are probably going to help you along a lot. Second one is make sure you try and create this relationship between strategic and tactical DDD. We all know that the tactical stuff is really addictive, and it's the way most people get into it. But you don't want to be looking at that stuff in isolation, and there's probably ways that we could have built this program to be even more focused on the strategic side. Things like context mapping and how that then feeds into the way that you write code is another thing we could have spent some time on. Probably what I would have spent some more resources on if I was to do it again. Number three, get really clear on what it is that you're trying to achieve. This kind of comes back to this high-level guiding principle concept, and I think that was really essential for us building something that was genuinely quite effective. I think if we didn't have that, there's a chance that we probably would have just compiled a random collection of DDD concepts together and then said, okay, here you go, work through that. And I don't think that would have had the same effect. And finally, have reasonable expectations from any training that you do run. People are going to get interested, and they're going to feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing, but it's not until they get into the real world and start dealing with real world problems and the complexity of real domains that they're going to realize that they have very tangible limitations. And that's good, because then you have discussions coming out of that, and people grow and people learn through that experience. It's an essential part of it, but you just can't get that from training alone. That's all I have to say. There's a link to PensionBee's DDD workshop on GitHub. I highly recommend you go and check it out, and even just use it as a bit of inspiration, or if you're in TypeScript lands, have a look and see how you can get started writing code in TypeScript without having to kind of go down one of these extreme object-oriented or functional programming paths. And there's a couple of social links that are connected to me if you want to connect or get in touch. I'd be more than happy to do that. So, yeah, if anyone has any questions, I don't think we have any talks on after this one, so I can hang around here and feel free to come down and grab me and we can have a chat. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a great rest of your conference.